A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger Rebbe.
For the 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany, the Olympic Games...
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. Schon 1000 Schabbos at the Skizar.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little. It is never too late. And it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem, Jewish historian and tour guide, Yehuda Geberer.
Yehuda Geberer with Jewish History Soundbites. This episode, in honor of the first yahrtzeit of the Novominsker Rebbe, Rabbi Yaakov Perlow, has been generously sponsored by Dovi Silberstein. For all back office, nursing home billing, contact Care Network Health, either phone or text 908-305-0595. Last year, we had a tribute episode. It was right after his unexpected passing, at the peak of the pandemic, and you might want to check out that episode as well. I'll post it, link to it. It was Erev Pesach last year. It was that time. It was when it seemed like the world was coming to an end, and it sure has been a historic year, commemorating the yahrtzeit of the Novominsk Rebbe now. So remember the whole year that has passed since then, from that peak of that pandemic time. It's hard to believe what we've all been through. We'll need some historical perspective on all this someday. So this year, a year later, it's a bit more time to reflect on the Novominsker Rebbe's place in Jewish history. So it's an opportunity to hear a little bit more about him and his background, his predecessors, his ancestors, his family. A lot of history there comes into place. It's been quite a year on the podcast as well, with more than 500,000 listens since last Pesach and constantly growing. So it's been quite a blessing for this podcast, and I want to thank you all listeners for tuning in and for listening, and always the great feedback that I get from you, and it's always great to hear from you all, so thank you. After Pesach, it's spring once again, and we're ready for season 2. I like the sound of that, of the city episode series. We're going to pick up from where we left off last year, profiling different cities. We called it the Great American Jewish Cities series last year. And we're ready to go again. We're going to start after Pesach. We're going to launch it. And if you want to sponsor your city, if you want your city's Jewish history story to be included in this series, so be in touch with me about that at yehuda@yehudageber.com. We'll get the story of your city told in Jewish history. If you haven't yet bought your Mishpacha magazine for Pesach, first of all, it's a good workout. It's heavy enough. It's like lifting weights when you pick it up from the store, or if you pick it up from your mailbox, if you subscribe. A lot of stuff there, a lot of material, but there's a lot of great content. But there's some of the stuff that Davi and I have prepared for you, which I think you'll find very interesting. First of all, there's an expanded For the Record column, a Yeki list. A list of Yeki talmidim, German students who went to the Mir Yeshiva in pre-war Poland. Very interesting, especially after the Nazi rise to power. Many of them who rose to prominence in the Jewish world. So you'll find that interesting. There's also an entire supplement, excuse me, in the expanded Mishpacha magazine for Pesach about brothers. And we profiled some very interesting pairs of brothers and one trio of brothers, prominent brothers in Jewish history. So that should be quite interesting as well. And last but not least, something that we really worked hard on. This is a real, genuine project. It was really, really nice. It came out very nice. if I might say so, the least, if I think so myself. I think you'll all appreciate it. Enormous amount of work. Davi and I interviewed people who had interacted with great Torah leaders of the previous generations. We call it eyes that saw angels. People who saw and interacted and encountered angels. People who to us are just legends, but they met them and actually talked to them. An amazing project. They're amazing people that we interviewed, and not just the stories that they told us, which are so interesting and historic, but also to get to meet these people, the ones who carried that message. And you'll enjoy them all. You'll really like it, so make sure to pick up your Mishpacha magazine. I also want to take this opportunity to note that it's exactly a year since we started our Mishpacha history column. For the record, was the Pesach edition last year, so it's exactly a year ago. So I want to thank all the professional staff at the Mishpacha magazine for giving us the opportunity to have this platform. Went out on a limb to have a Jewish history, such a boring topic, and to be able to include that in their magazine was very brave of them. And so we hope that you all enjoy it, and we love all the great feedback that we constantly get from all our readers of that as well. Another very important announcement. It's hard to believe, but it seems that this spring or summer, we might actually be going back on the touring trail. I haven't even seen an airplane in well over a year, and definitely not been on one. But it looks like that the world might be going back to normal, or somewhat normal, or we'll see what type of normal it is. So there are some things that are brewing, so stay tuned for details, when and where and all that, and hopefully we'll have some trips available pretty soon as well. So I want to get to the Novominsker Rebbe, Rabbi Yaakov Perlow, his yahrtzeit, a year since his passing. And last year I mentioned that he was a man of many hats, many talents, also and primarily a leader in many ways of the Jewish people in the last half a century. I asked last year on the tribute episode, I also profiled somewhat the Novominsk Hasidic dynasty, where he came from. So this year I want to delve a bit more into both of those points, who he was and his career, his diverse positions, and also how he fits into the bigger scope of Jewish history, where he came from, and different aspects of that also. So let's just review his basic bio of his positions, even though I mentioned it last year, but just to get back into it. He was born in the United States. He went to Chaim Berlin Yeshiva. He was a student of Rav Yitzchak Zelig, and then he used to actually, I don't think I mentioned this last year, he used to go to the newly established Beis HaTalmud Yeshiva in East New York. Chaim Berlin in those days was in Brownsville, so East New York's right there. And he used to speak to the Altamiris. He was always seeking to, what more, what other diversity he can incorporate into his Yiddishkeit. Very interesting. He also attended Brooklyn College. He was a Rosh Yeshiva at Hebrew Theological College in Skokie for several years, for about 7 years in the 1960s. And when he came there in the 60s, there were some into Skokie, to Chicago. There were some older and very important Rebbeim there, still from Slobodka and other pre-war yeshivas. But Rav Yaakov Perlow, this is his first position, this is his first Rebbe position. He was young, he was American, he spoke a perfect English, and he was a huge Talmud Chacham. And these high school kids, he taught 11th grade. That was his official position. These high school kids, he was like their role model. They wanted to be like him. When Reb Aaron Soloveitchik came to the yeshiva to deliver his first shir in the yeshiva in Skokie, he became a yeshiva in Skokie. So the Rebbe said to his talmidim, here's a great man. We should all learn Torah from him. And he inspired them to reach up to Rav Soloveitchik to learn from him. And he said to them, I myself learned by him. I was by him in Chaim Berlin when I was younger. Rav Aaron Soloveitchik was in Chaim Berlin in the earlier part of his career. He was like a father to his students in Skokie. He would even later on in life, when he maintained, he was still in touch with them. So he would do mundane things with them. He would, if they were seeking employment and they are asking him advice about that, so he would ask to review their contract with them. Let's go line by line, making sure they're getting a good deal from their new boss. He literally was interested in every aspect of their lives, throughout their lives. When a student couple would arrive to ask advice, so one of the students related from his Skokie days, he said that the Rebbe asked his wife what do you say? What do you have to say about this? So she said, what do you mean? We came to ask the Rebbe's advice. So he says, well, I want to hear what you have to say about it. He would answer the phone himself when someone called his home. He didn't have any gabbai or any other family member answering the phone. He was the 11th grade Rebbe there in the 1960s. He was the one who transformed the curriculum at Skokie for a post-high school program to study 3 sdarim a day, to learn Torah the entire day, which was a big novelty there in Skokie in the 1960s. There was a smicha program. There was, but he incorporated what he started as for a post high school. He called it the MS program, Igud Masmidei Torah, and he was in charge of it. He convinced parents to send their kids to push off college for a year or two. He convinced the administration to have this program there. And he became the Rebbe of it. He was also the 11th grade. He gave 11th grade shir, but he was also in charge of this post-high school program. So he would give a shir, a high-level shir in the morning with Reb Chaim Brisker, all the Litvish alumnus, and at night he would give a shir in Chassidus. He would give Sfas Emes. So he was someone who, like I mentioned last year, incorporated all worlds into his worldview. He was able to be there for the American kids in Chicago. He was able to be with the Sfas Emes. He was able to be with Reb Chaim. He was there with everything. He would invite the students to his home. He studied with them. He taught them that they can do it too. They can become great. A couple of days before Shavuos every year, he institute shifts to study Torah in the Beis Medrash throughout all hours of the night. He wanted to show his students in Skokie that they can get up in the middle of the night at 2 o'clock in the morning and study Torah. This way there would be someone learning in the Beis Medrash for the 3 days before Shavuos at all hours. He was very novel with the ideas that he had. In fact, they were so close to him. Over a half a century after he had finished this rather short stint, 7-year stint in Skokie, there was a group of alumni who gathered on one of his visits to Israel and made him a Lava Malka. So 50 some odd years later, some of them were Rosh Yeshiva, rabbis, and all of them who started on their path by the would-be Rebbe, who was still not even a Rebbe then. He would even write letters to his talmidim. He would send his students in Skokie to go learn in yeshivas in Eretz Yisrael, in Kerem B'Yavne, and Mir, and other places, and he would write letters to them. He would keep in touch with them. Unbelievable. It's really amazing stories just from his Skokie years. Later on, he was a Rosh Yeshiva in Breuers, in Yeshivas Rabbeinu Shamshav Hirsch, part of the Agudas Yisroel and KJ Kehila. And he was a Rosh Yeshiva there for 11 years, from 1970 to 1981. I mentioned this last year also. And he had a very close relationship with Rav Breuer. He sought out his advice for everything. He very much was impressed by the Yeki community in Washington Heights. And he lived in the Heights for part of that time. He was a rabbi in the shul there. He maintained a relationship and delivered classes in the community even after he left. The Rebbe said that he revered Rav Breuer. Very interesting. He said he saw him as a figure of Jewish history, which he was. He's someone who also we have to have an episode on, Rav Joseph Breuer. Amazing person. One day we'll have on him, if you want to sponsor. And one time when he was living in Washington Heights, when he was a Rosh Yeshiva there in Breuers, so the Rebbe made a bar mitzvah for his son, or his twin sons, I don't remember. And so his father, the Novominsk Rebbe, Nachum Mordechai Perlow, came for Shabbos to Washington Heights, the previous Novominsk Rebbe. And he says to his son, on Sunday morning, we have to visit Rav Breuer. He's the rabbi. He's the Mara Asra of the town, of the Kehila, of the community. So we have to pay our respects tomorrow morning. That's what he told him on Shabbos afternoon. A few minutes after Havdalah, Rav Breuer shows up at the door. He beat them to it. He comes to visit. He was the rabbi, but he came to visit the Novominsker Rebbe. The Novominsker Rebbe actually would ask Rav Breuer advice about everything. A very unique relationship. Two people from such different worlds, and yet the Rebbe was always amazed that Rav Breuer was able to rebuild the Frankfurt community of KJ and really respected the traditions of that community. So that was also another stint. He was a rabbi of a shul I mentioned. He became the Novominsk Rebbe, so now he becomes a Hasidic Rebbe upon his father's passing. And he's also the Rosh Yeshiva of his own yeshiva. He opens the Novominsk Yeshiva in Borough Park. So he's literally doing everything. And that's not the least of it, because the main thing that he's remembered for is being a leader in the Jewish world. He was a leader of the Agudas Yisroel, leader of the Mi'atzes, leader of Torah Masorah. He wrote articles, he wrote Sfarim. He was a public speaker, a very dynamic and charismatic speaker. He had personal interactions and cared for people, and he was literally a man who seemed to just to be able to do it all. Someone who really understood the world, he understood the circumstances of the world, and who would take the responsibility and the wisdom to make decisions for Klal Yisrael, for the Jewish people. Very non-judgmental. He was someone who really understood Jewish society in the 20th and 21st centuries. So that was, that's about him. I wanted to speak also was about where he came from, which I touched on last year in the Novominsk side, and I want to explore a little bit further in the different areas of Jewish life that were in his family and his history. So we spoke about his Novominsk ancestors a bit last year, and I just want to fill in a couple of holes on the Novominsk side, actually. I mentioned how his father, Rav Mordechai Perlow, immigrated. He was a Novominsk Rebbe. He immigrated to the United States in 1927, settles on the Lower East Side, and then in Crown Heights. His father, Rav Mordechai Perlow, as the Novominsk Rebbe, happened to have a younger brother. And his younger brother's name was Rav Joseph Breuer. When their father, the two previous Novominsker Rebbes before that, his name was Rav Yisroel Shimon, we spoke about him last year on the tribute. So he passed away in Warsaw in 1933. So his older son, Rav Mordechai, was already living in the United States. So who becomes the Novominsker Rebbe in Poland? The younger brother, Rav Joseph Perlow, who becomes the Rebbe of Novominsk in Warsaw. But what's interesting is that he was 17 years old and he was still single, which is pretty rare for a Rebbe to be 17 and single, but he was. And that was the Novominsker Rebbe he eventually got married, Novominsker Rebbe in Warsaw before the war. He was in the Warsaw ghetto during the war. When the ghetto uprising broke out, right now it's on Pesach, so it fits in the sort of uprising with the Rebbe. So it breaks out on Pesach. So Rabbi Yosef Perlow, the Novominsker Rebbe, in other words, the Rabbi Yaakov Perlow, the Rebbe who we're talking about, his uncle. It's his father's brother, his father's younger brother. So Rabbi Yosef Perlow, his house in the ghetto was one of the places where they stored the matzahs that were clandestinely baked in the ghetto. Again, before the uprising, what are the Hasidim in the ghetto concerned about is the last deportations to Treblinka are starting. There's the uprising breaking out. The Nazis are coming into the ghetto. And what are they doing? They're baking matzahs and storing it at the Novominsker Rebbe's house, and he's the one who distributes matzahs to the ghetto poor on the last Pesach in Warsaw. Unbelievable story. And he's deported to Auschwitz, and we're at risk to his life, actually. He used to protest whenever a capo was beating a fellow inmate. He would get up and protest when everyone else was scared for their own lives and security and wouldn't be able to say anything. He would get up and say and stand up for his fellow Jew, that he shouldn't be beaten by the capo. And Yom Kippur in Auschwitz, he actually hummed Kol Nidre, lying on his bunk in his barracks in Auschwitz, and a few Jews around him joined in, and they had this minimal Yom Kippur service in the barracks of Auschwitz. He survives the death march at the end of the war. He survived Bergen-Belsen, where the death march arrived at, and he's liberated. And then he passes away, unfortunately, a few days later from a typhus epidemic that broke out after liberation in Bergen-Belsen. A tragic ending to the Novominsker Rebbe of Poland, Rabbi Yosef Perlow. No one in his family survived the war either. So this was the Rebbe's uncle. There's another line, actually, from the first Novominsker Rebbe. I spoke about him last year. Rabbi Yaakov Perlow, his namesake. So Rabbi Yaakov Perlow was the first Novominsker Rebbe. So he had the one line that went down to, like I said, Rabbi Yisroel Shimon and Rabbi Mordechai, and then Rabbi Yaakov Perlow, the Novominsker Rebbe. But there was other sons of this original Rabbi Yaakov Perlow, the first Novominsker Rebbe. There was another son named Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh, who immigrated to the United States in 1922, was a Rebbe in Williamsburg. He was also a pioneer of Agudas Yisroel. There was another son of this original Rabbi Yaakov of Novominsk named Reb Shlomo Chaim, who was a Rebbe in Bolchov, and then he and his family were killed out in the Holocaust. He was actually a mechutin of the Piasetzner Rebbe. Interesting connection there. Either way, that's on the Novominsk side. But there's also his maternal side. The Novominsker Rebbe's mother was Rebbetzin Bela Ruchama, and her father, who I briefly mentioned last year, I want to speak about him a little bit more and his world, this year, now a little bit. So his grandfather, his maternal grandfather, this Rebbetzin Bela Ruchama's father, his name was Rav Yitzchak Zelig Morgenstern, the Sokolov Rebbe, a scion of the Kotzk dynasty, a great-grandson of the Kotzker. So you have Kotzk, which we had a few episodes about. There's a lot to say. Still plenty more to say about Kotzk. But But the Kotzk, we usually, when we talk about Kotzk, we usually say how when the Kotzker passed away, so it moved on to his students. The Chidushei Harim, Ger, and Sachachav, which was his also family, was his son-in-law. But the Kotzk dynasty actually continued to a certain extent in Kotzk by the Kotzk Rebbe's son. He had a son named Reb David who succeeded him, and he in turn was succeeded by his son, Reb Yisroel Morgenstern, who was a fascinating Rebbe of his day. He's a grandson of the Kotzker. One day we have to do an episode about the Kotzk descendants. It's some very interesting stories, some very interesting personalities there. Reb Yisroel was in Kotzk. Later on, in 1888, he moved to Perlow, another town nearby. And he joined this Reb Yisroel Morgenstern, the grandson of the Kotzker, great-grandfather of the Novominsker Rebbe, and father of the Sokolov Rebbe. So this Reb Yisroel, he joins and supports the Chayvevei Tzion movement, the Lovers of Zion movement. He even tried to organize a group of 1,000 Hasidim to buy land in Israel and settle there, an agricultural settlement, and to the mitzvahs hatzluyas ba'aretz, the special mitzvahs that are pertinent only in working the land, only in farming the land. And he organized a group called Agudas Yisroel to have 1,000 farmers. And he got some seed money, an initial investment. And the main investor was supposed to be Rothschild, because he was building all those colonies at the time as the first Aliyah. And he was supposed to match it. First, one of the early matching campaigns, but Rothschild backed out. So hope that doesn't happen at any of the matching campaigns these days, that the matchers back out, because what happened is that when Rothschild backed out, the whole plan fell through. They didn't have enough funding, so it didn't work out. This settlement that the Perlow Rebbe, Reb Yisroel Morgenstern, had in mind. In 1891, he goes a step further, very controversial at the time. He authors a pamphlet called Shalom Yerushalayim, and about settling in Israel, and about the Geula. In essence, it was a harbinger of the Messianic Zionism. It's so wild. It's from such an early source. It was way before Rav Kook or anyone else. A very unlikely source. He a Hasidic Rebbe from Poland, the grandson of the Kotzker. Very unique and interesting story of ideas of Messianic Zionism at the time. There was lots of opposition. He did get an approbation to his sefer from the Avnei Nezer, and even a begrudging one from the Sfas Emes, who was not very supportive of the ideas there, but still he wrote a letter of support to him. But on the other hand, he faced a lot of opposition for these ideas. Understandably, one of them was from the Radzina Rebbe. It goes back to the Ishbitz-Kotzk divide. So here was another reason for the two opposing factions to have what to dispute about. So there's no surprises there. But even more surprising, what was surprising was even from his own son, the future Sokolov Rebbe, Rav Yitzchak Zelig Morgenstern, in his own chutzner, he faces opposition. So this is the emes of Kotzk, how it continues, that the son opposes ideologically his father. This is the grandfather of the Novominsk Rebbe. He says this is wrong, this is not the right way, and he didn't support what his father was doing. Unfortunately, afterwards, Reb Yisroel sustained some personal family tragedies. His wife and his daughter passed away in succession, and he dropped the whole thing. Later on, his son, the Sokolov Rebbe, he said that his father liked the Chayvevei Tzion movement when the movement was in Odessa, the Russian Zionists, because then it was about building colonies, establishing farming colonies, agricultural settlements, settling the land. And he much less liked what later developed into the political Zionism, which arose with Herzl, that he was less supportive of. So he clarified his father's position. So when the Perlow Rebbe passed away in 1905, all four of his sons became prominent Rebbes. A whole story for another time. Most famous, though, was his oldest son, who we're speaking about, who was the Novominsk Rebbe's grandfather, Rav Yitzchak Zelig Morgenstern, the Sokolov Rebbe. He had an amazing life. The Novominsker Rebbe never met his grandfather, his mother's father. Why? Because the Sokolov Rebbe passed away at the beginning of the war, when Rabbi Yaakov Perlow, the future Novominsk Rebbe, was not even 10 years old, living in Lower East Side in the United States. So he never even met him. Yet it's fascinating how many similarities there are between the two of them. The Sokolov Rebbe, like I said, grew up in Kotzk. He was a student of his grandfather, of David, who was the oldest son of the Kotzker. He becomes a rabbi, again, a town rabbi, not yet a Rebbe. He was the Rav of a town, a big Talmid Chacham, a tremendous person, Pesach also, and he becomes the town rabbi in Sokolov. So when he becomes, he's not Sokolov Rebbe yet, he's now the Sokolov Rav. Not only that, but he becomes also a Sokolov Rosh Yeshiva. He establishes a yeshiva for young yeshiva students in the town. So he's a Rav, he's the Rosh Yeshiva, and then he also becomes a Rebbe with his father's passing. On his own, he was an autodidactic. I hope I said that right. If I didn't, then it's because I'm not autodidactic. So he studied on his own foreign languages, including Latin, believe it or not. He studied medicine on his own. He would even write medical prescriptions to get medicine from the local pharmacist. Unbelievable. So he was one of the greatest leaders of Polish Jewry. Even before World War I, when Poland was still part of the Russian Empire, he participated in the famous St. Petersburg Rabbinical Conference called by the Tsar. There he met Reb Chaim Brisker and the Rashab of Chabad, who he had a relationship with, both of those two as well. Later on, he's one of the founders and leaders and members of the Moetzes Gedolei HaTorah of the Agudas Yisroel in Poland. He attended all three Knessia Gedolos of Agudas Yisroel. He would be one of the speakers there. He had a great sense of humor, so people like to hear him, like to talk to him. He would make jokes a lot, especially when he spoke to younger students, the youth. He understood that the way to get to the youth was through humor. That's what he believed. And he was very, very active in Agudas Yisroel. And despite his opposition to Zionism, he still inherited from his father a love of settling the land. And he encouraged Tzirei Agudas Yisroel and Perlow Agudas Yisroel, the two daughter movements of the original Agudas Yisroel in Poland, the two subsidiaries rather of the Agudas Yisroel in Poland, to attend hachsharot, like kibbutzim, basically, of training to be able to make aliyah, to be able to move. This is in Poland before the war, and to be able to become farmers and work in agriculture when they get to Israel. This is Polish Hasidim. He encouraged them to do that. Amazingly unique. Unique idea for someone who is a Polish Hasidic Rebbe opposed to Zionism. So he was able to make that, maintain that balance, that what he believed was good and what he believed should be done and shouldn't be done. He even visited Eretz Yisrael in 1924, and when he returned to Warsaw, thousands of Hasidim gathered to hear his impression of his visit, and he said, "My fellow Jews, Yidden, go to the Holy Land. It's a good place." So this is 1924 in Poland. A very, very unique individual. He's one of the founders of the Agudas Rabbanim in Poland. He had a close relationship with many of the leading rabbis of his day, such as Reb Nachum Zember, Bechonin Wasserman, others. He was very active, like I said, on behalf of the Aguda in leadership. He wrote articles very often for the religious newspapers about the Aguda and about other topics. Again, this is not so common for a Hasidic Rebbe to write articles in the press, in the media. This wasn't common then, and it's not even common now. And he was one of the founders of the famous Mesivta of Warsaw, which the Ger Rebbe was involved in. He was very close to the Ger Rebbe, the Remes. He was a big supporter of developing, again, a unique visionary, developing the field of Jewish literature for children. He said, we used to not need common literature, stories. But today we do. And it's something to think about, really, because we take something like that, something so basic as Jewish literature for youth, in our society is something we take for granted. But then, in Poland, in pre-war, it was revolutionary and required a certain element of vision. So who was the one perceiving that need? And who's the one pushing it and supporting it? And had that vision? It was the Sokolov Rebbe, grandson of the Kotzk in pre-war Poland. On the first Yom Kippur of the war, his oldest son, unfortunately, Reb Mendel, who was a Rav in Vengrov, was stabbed to death by the Nazis, becoming one of the first victims of the Holocaust. He himself passes away a few weeks later and was buried in the Warsaw Jewish Cemetery right near his mechutin, the Novominsker Rebbe. His son, Rabbi Yamin Paltiel, became the Sokolov Rebbe in his place. And so this is essentially the Novominsker Rebbe's uncle, right? His uncle, his mother's brother. And he ran a yeshiva. This Rabbi Yamin Paltiel, he was a Rav in a town near Warsaw. And he's in the Warsaw ghetto during the war. And he's employed at the famous Schultz shop, along with many other Rebbes. The original owner of the shop, Rav Ram Hendel, very special Jew, who was actually Sokolov Rebbe. He tried to save his own Rebbe and many, many other of the great rabbis and Hasidic Rebbes in Warsaw, in the Warsaw ghetto, which staved off the danger for a while. Eventually, the Nazis had them all killed anyway, but it pushed it off for a while. He had them officially employed in this shoe shop which was run by Fritz Schultz, a German manager, and so this. Rabbi Paltiel, Rabbi Yon Paltiel, the Sokolov Rebbe, during the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, again, Pesach time, he was deported to Auschwitz, and he passes away of hunger and weakness shortly before the Russian liberation of the camp. His entire family was wiped out as well. Now, that's all on the Novominsk Rebbe's mother's Sokolov Kotzk side. The Novominsk Rebbe himself, his connection to Chicago wasn't limited to Skokie, to Hebrew Theological College. His Rebbitzin, the Novominsk Rebbe's wife, was from Chicago as well. In fact, both of his wives were from Chicago because he married sisters. First, he married Rebbitzin Yehudis Eichenstein, and then when she passed away in the late 90s, in the late 1990s, so he goes ahead and several years later marries her sister, who was a widow, Rebbitzin Etel Miriam Eichenstein. So, I guess he couldn't handle more than one mother-in-law, so he had to marry, his second wife was a sister. But anyway, so he marries into the Eichenstein family from Chicago. So who are they? Who are the Eichensteins? So his father-in-law actually was Rav Eichenstein of the Zidichov Hasidic dynasty. So you have a completely another world of Zidichov coming into the picture now. So what's the background on Zidichov? So it's an old dynasty. It's one of the most important, actually, even though numerically may have been not one of the largest, but it was very, very important. Explain why in a second. Kamarna also came from Zidichov, a few other smaller dynasties. Tosh, Spinka, it came in the Galicia, Hungary, Ukraine area. That's where its influence was. Rabbi Hirsch Eichenstein of Zidichov, who was Rabbi Yitzchak Zelig, he was talmid of the name of Melech, Hirsch, and the big thing about Zidichov was they were Kabbalists, they were mystics. There was a dispute in the Hasidic movement, in the later generations, about how one should dilute the Kabbalah when it becomes a mass movement and the masses are joining the movement. Do we dilute the message of the Kabbalah? Do we bring it down to the masses? Do we remove it altogether? The Kabbalistic element. We know that, of course, the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid were Kabbalists, were mystics, definitely, and they were very much involved in it. It was very much incorporated into the Agudas Yisroel in the early generations of the movement. And then it was diluted because the Rebbe's consciously, the great tzadikim of the early generations of Hasidus, the third and fourth generations, they perceived the needs of the generation and the capabilities of once it became a mass movement and expanded it beyond an elitist circle like it was in the early generations, and or it may have even been intended for by the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid, contrary to popular belief that it was initially intended for the masses, and definitely nothing in the evidence that supports that, but that's for another time. So I think I've mentioned that several times, but the idea was how much should Kabbalah play a role in Hasidic thought and belief in the later generations. And Zidichov was one of the only ones, Chabad to a certain extent also, it's a different story, but Zidichov was one of the only ones who became like these Baal Shem Tov purists when it came to Kabbalah. To emphasize Kabbalah, to put out Sifrei Kabbalah, to write new Sifrei Kabbalah, and to keep mysticism and Kabbalistic endeavors as part of the Hasidic Avodah throughout the generations. They kept it going. They refused to budge and compromise 1 inch on the Kabbalah, and they kept it very much part of it. So either way, that's Zidichov. So eventually, one of the Zidichov Einiklach, one of the descendants of the dynasty, Rabbi Yeshua Heschel Eichenstein, who was the Rav in Chodrov. He was in the 5th generation of the dynasty, and he was in the rabbinate. He served again as a town rabbi. So a few years after World War I, in the early 1920s, he moves to the United States. He immigrates, and he moves to Chicago. Early 1920s to Chicago, which is unheard of, rare for a Hasidic Rebbe to move. And the ones who did it, they all moved to New York. To go to Chicago in that time was almost unheard of for a Hasidic Rebbe, and he starts to build Hasidus in Chicago. And eventually his son, Rabbi Avram, who was the father-in-law twice over of the Novominsker Rebbe, becomes the Zidichov Rebbe in Chicago, and he passes away in the 1960s. Interestingly enough, the Zidichov Rebbe, Rabbi Avram, Eichenstein, his son, Reb Moshe, marries the daughter of Reb Nachum Mordechai Perlow, who's the previous Novominsker Rebbe. So incredibly enough, they were brothers-in-law. The Novominsker Rebbe with his brother-in-law, Reb Moshe Eichenstein, were brothers-in-law 3 times over, which is not bad. So that's a little bit about the Eichenstein Zidichov side as well. So this was a yahrtzeit tribute to the Novominsker Rebbe. This is Yehuda Gabriel, Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudagabriel.com for questions, comments, tours, trips, hopefully soon, lectures, sponsorships. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on Podbean or your favorite podcast platform. Follow us on Twitter at JSoundbites, and I hope you enjoyed.